Thanks for coming out tonight. I apologize to those of you who heard me speak last night that you've had to do it twice in a row, but you made the choice. It's your problem. This is a great opportunity for me because I do talks in libraries, bookstores, schools, various colleges. What I talk about on those occasions has a lot to do with politics, but I always feel slightly frustrated because the question inevitably comes up in a Q&A session, well, what can we do about what we were talking about? And for once, here to help raise funds for Jay's campaign and the actual change that has to come about in one congressional district and be imitated all across the country in 2012, at last I have a chance to actually say, here's something you can do practically, which tonight is to raise money to counter the corporate strength and monolith that the Republican Party has become with the aid of the Supreme Court, which has unleashed secret and hidden corporate financing without limit into our political life. And so tonight's talk actually has a conclusion which has to do with the solution to some of the problems that I'll be touching on. So it's a relief for me and an honor to be here with you all tonight because we can point to something practical that we can do and just instead of taking rage and frustration out into the night, we can actually aim this frustration at our national situation in a very positive direction, which is to raise money for one campaign and win it, which is what has to happen here and in many other districts. In the introduction was a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of part of my life, and I'll just fill in a couple of points and then move to what I think should be the subject of the talk tonight about what we confront in America in terms of what the Republican Party has become. I grew up, as was mentioned, and as those of you who read the memoirs that I've written, the so-called God series, Crazy for God, Patience with God, and now Sex, Mom, and God. I told somebody earlier that I could have sold more books of the last title if I had called it Sex with Mom and God. But it would have been to a less serious readership, I think, somehow. But in any case, if you read those books, you'll know that I come from a very unlikely background to be standing here tonight. If you had 50-odd years ago picked out a candidate to be raising money for Jay here tonight, it would not have been me, because I was living in a little Swiss village, the son of two obscure fundamentalist American missionaries who had come over to Europe to save pagan Roman Catholics and other members of the poor of Babylon's tribe from the devil, and had established a tiny community on a mountainside called L'Abri Fellowship, which then grew into a worldwide phenomenon with branches in 6 or 7 countries, and people like, for instance, Barbara Bush coming and spending time with my parents in the 70s and early 80s, etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to tell that story tonight. I tell it in the books, and I'm not going to talk about why I got out of that movement. Just take it as read that I left for very good reason in the mid-80s, and by the 90s was completely finished with it, and anathema to that side of the equation. Tonight I want to talk about the substance of what that movement is, and I only mention my background because when it comes to this issue, unlike most of the things that I'll talk about to my family and other people, I actually know what I'm talking about. I grew up in the religious right. Without my family's involvement, there would be no religious right as we know it today. And very much following the example of the leadership of North Korea, I was part of that evangelical nepotistic tradition where you may not get the call from the Holy Spirit, but you certainly do inherit the mailing list. And which is a lot more useful, by the way, in many ways. So I come from the background that I'm talking about and had the misfortune to be part of the problem that we're trying to address tonight. That said, I'd like to point out what I think is the basic fact of American history right now, and it coincides with the basic fact of world history right now. Had we been living in 1929, 1931, 32, and you had had a prescient view of the future, you would say the basic fact of world history was about to be the emergence of fascism. That's not the basic fact of today, although that word is loosely thrown around by progressives, often inaccurately about the right. What we're seeing around the world today, and America has been caught up in its own version of it, is the rise of a reactionary religious fundamentalism, not just Christian evangelical, Islamic, Hindu, and all points in between, that is reacting to modernity, science, and fact because they are afraid and threatened by the progress of the human race out of a medieval mindset which gives them their power when it comes to the leadership, gives them a certainty where there can be none, gives them a sense of purpose. And so it's no coincidence that in the same time frame that we have found, the same time frame in the sense of decades, not months, a Michel Bachmann, a Rick Perry, etc., a W. Bush arising out of this fundamentalist environment, that for the first time in 100 years, Christian missionaries have been killed in India by Hindu nationalists who say they must bring India back to their roots in the same way that our evangelical fundamentalists talk about bringing America back to God. It's no coincidence that if you changed a few words in the pitch that someone like Rick Perry gives at his prayer meeting with which he launches a national campaign, and you substituted the word Jesus or God for Allah, you could be reading from statements by the Taliban. Because the impetus is a fundamentalist religious reaction against modernity. In America, we have our own version of that. We're not putting kids in madrasas to shelter them from chemistry and math and biology and science and physics while they mindlessly repeat passages of the Quran. We instead have a homeschool movement that shelters kids in a different way and says we're keeping them out of public schools, which are now evil. Even private schools are not to be trusted. We will make up our own curriculum out of the King James Bible. We will beat the hell out of our children if they misbehave. In fact, we will make a million-seller bestseller out of a book called To Raise Up a Child, to train up a child, rather, that advocates spanking children from the age of 6 months on, using a ruler or a stick. Within America, we have enclaves that would make portions of Saudi Arabia look liberated. There are, in our own communities, everywhere in this country, people living in their own Middle Ages. We have in this country a movement that is so far right and reactionary that when one of my old Republican friends, Jack Kemp, who was Bob Dole's running mate, called me about 15 years ago after he read one of my first articles denouncing the religious right and explaining why I was getting out of it, Jack called up and said, "You're saying exactly the right thing. If these people take over the Republican Party, we're finished." And that's very interesting because he certainly was a conservative Republican, as was Eisenhower or even a Goldwater or a Bob Dole, but he was not this kind of religious fanatic. You could still discuss issues. So you might disagree with someone like Jack on economics and not believe in the trickle-down theory or supply-side economics, but at least you were looking at the same piece of paper and the same facts, and we were still all on planet Earth. And if you disagreed with Jack, he didn't say your views were of the devil and that you were un-American or not a real American, and that we had to save the country from people like you, the other. Now we're in a very different place, and the way I expressed it the other night, and I'll say it again here, is that in the 70s and 80s, my dad and I, and people like C. Everett Koop, James Dobson, and others, who were asking the political people in the Republican Party to do something about our issues, we were agitators standing on the outside, knocking on the door, saying, please let us in, do something about abortion, gay rights, prayer in schools, whatever our issues that we were using to raise funds, etc., were at the moment. But we were talking to what you might call ordinary, normal, decent politicians whose views of the country could have been taken from the same sheet. It's just they disagreed on solutions to problems they all agreed were real enough, whether economic or environmental or whatever. But they were all very firmly still on planet Earth. So, for instance, an example I use is Bill Buckley, who I knew and who was a friend of my father's. Bill would go and have debates with liberals and the other side, but also could be their friends because he had not demonized them. He didn't believe because they disagreed over policy that they were evil. Now, in the context today, what has changed is this. The people who believe what we believed back in the 70s are no longer knocking on the door, as it were, freelance religious lobbyists trying to get normal politicians to agree with their agenda. They are the politicians. It's the equivalent in the left as if the Weather Underground had actually run candidates for the presidency who had a chance to win with the radical, violent program that the Weather Underground was espousing. We in this country have our own Taliban. And their view of America, in the best of all worlds, is that it would be a theocracy, although they would not name it as such because they're too politically savvy, that would do away with the idea of the rule of law and superimpose above the rule of law what they would call biblical absolutes. And of course, those biblical absolutes would be interpreted by who else? Them. And so what you've got really in this election with Jay here in this district and nationwide is two things going on. One is business as usual, normal politics. What do we do about nuclear waste? What happens to the road system here, our schools and so forth? And that's still continuing. But there's another element that is different than business as usual. And that is a national choice which is far more weighty. And that's the direction of our future history. Is America going to stumble towards becoming its own version of Iran and a Christianized theocracy with its own version of Sharia law, and people in the highest echelons of power who despise this country as it is because it allows gay rights, women's choice, etc., etc.? Or are we going to maintain the rule of law? Forget left, right, Republican, Democrat. I'm talking about much bigger fish to fry than that. Are we going to be recognizable as the United States of America 10, 15, 20 years from now, or not? Because when you allow the agitator to become the candidate and they bring a whole program in with them, you're not in the same situation as we were before, where you sort of always assume, well, if people get to the highest reaches of politics as a congressman or a senator or a president, then somehow they're going to have to be normal, sane people, and maybe they've got to throw a sock net once in a while to the left or to the right, or this or that extremist, or satisfy the religious people by phoning in a message on a national day of prayer or a prayer breakfast or something. But we know that in their head, everything's clicking as it should be. They see colors the way we do, and they think about things the way we do. When you have the actual agitators and the fanatics become the party itself, and or our presidential candidates who have to pretend they are fanatics in order to get the votes of the people who control the nominating process, you're in a different place. And that's where we are today. And I want to be very clear about something. What Jay is up against and what we're up against in America is a Republican Party that is no longer a political party. It is religion masquerading as politics. And that's a totally different deal, because you no longer have a baseline of honesty and sincerity. I saw it very clearly when Michelle Bachmann was asked that question in a debate about submission to her husband. She looked into the camera and told a bare-faced, calculated, rehearsed lie. She said, submission in our family just means we get along and we respect each other. And yet she comes out of a wing of evangelicalism, wherein back in 2006, when asked why she ran for Congress to begin with, she said, because my husband told me to, which is the same reason I went to law school, because she believes in wifely submission in the same way that the Saudi royal family does, which is a medieval concept of misogyny coming straight out of the pages of the Bible that I talk about in my book, Sex, Mom, and God, and that you have both in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, that when taken at face value as a fundamentalist truth, leads to misogynistic, intolerant, oppressive cultures, of which, by the way, the Christian West was for centuries. And some of the earliest canons of the church reflect that. Now, the blessing within Christianity, by the way, if I can just add a footnote, and within Islam, and in all world religions, is there's always been other paths offered as well. Not all people who are Christians are intolerant, bigots, homophobes, and misogynists, because you have church fathers who spoke against this path. The problem is right now, the word Christian in this culture has become almost solely identified with the harsh, misogynistic, homophobic, reactionary path that's been there from the beginning and has revived its ugly head in our day and age. And the reason it's revived its head in our day and age is because it has reacted to a modernity it cannot explain or understand, whether it's the creationists trying to supplant science in the schools, whether it is people who have gone sour on the whole public school project because they can't control every aspect of what their children learn, whether you see it manifested in the non-sex education of the silver ring thing, which makes people wear a ring and vow chastity, and they're not given any information about contraception or anything else. It's been proven to fail. Nevertheless, George W. Bush put $1,700,000 into the silver ring thing and funded it with government funding for a sex education program that's a non-sex education program, an anti-sex education program. And there's a correlation and a parallel with this. 87 freshman congressmen who go to Washington as non-congressmen, not to serve the country, but actually shut the government down and make our credit rating fall on its nose by not refinancing the debt limit, which no